When you think of America's first colony, you probably imagine brave settlers and big feasts. But Jamestown in the 1600s was nothing like that. It was mud, hunger, and desperation. These weren't holiday meals, they were survival meals. From roasted fish and corn gifted by native tribes, to rats, snakes, and even boiled shoe leather when things got bad. Every bite told a story of struggle, grit, and sometimes pure horror. Stick with me, because the 25 foods served at Jamestown will shock you, surprise you, and maybe even make you grateful for what's on your plate today. 1. Roasted maize on the cob. Before there was bread, before there were potatoes, there was maize. Corn was the lifeline of Jamestown, and without the powhatan showing settlers how to roast it on the cob, many wouldn't have made it through those first brutal years. Picture this: smoke rising from a small fire, kernels blistering and popping, a scent both sweet and earthy filling the camp. To men who had crossed the ocean expecting feasts of meat and wheat bread, roasted maize felt both strange and miraculous. It was chewy, filling, and, most importantly, it kept them alive. But here's the kicker. Maize wasn't just food, it was culture. To the English, it looked like a humble ear of corn. To the powhatan, it was life itself, grown, shared, and honored. That first bite wasn't just survival, it was a bridge between two worlds. And yet, while corn gave them strength, what came next nearly broke them. 2. Venison roasted on spits. Now, when corn wasn't enough, the settlers turned to something that felt a little more familiar: meat. Venison, hunted in the thick Virginia woods, became a prized feast at Jamestown. Imagine the scene: a crude wooden spit turning slowly over an open flame, the smell of rich venison fat dripping into the fire, crackling and sending smoke into the humid night air. For men starving on barley mush and salt fish, this was pure treasure. But here's the twist. Deer wasn't always easy to come by. Hunting required skill, stealth, and sometimes permission. Much of the game in those forests belonged to the powhatan, and without their cooperation, settlers risked violent conflict for every shot of meat. Some nights the spits were full and bellies felt satisfied. Other nights, the fires burned low and only the memory of venison lingered. And while roasted deer gave settlers hope, the real surprise came from the water. Because just a few steps from camp, the James River held a secret bounty so overwhelming it shocked the hungry colonists. 3. Sturgeon steaks on the fire. If Jamestown had a symbol of abundance, it was the sturgeon. These massive river fish, some weighing hundreds of pounds, swam thick in the James River when the settlers arrived. Imagine hauling one onto shore, slicing thick steaks, and laying them over open flames. The rich, oily flesh fed dozens at once. For a brief moment, Jamestown must have felt almost like paradise. But here's the shocking twist. What started as a miracle became a nightmare. The settlers leaned so heavily on sturgeon that when the river's cycle shifted and the fish disappeared for months, panic set in. No sturgeon meant no safety net. Some men starved, others turned to desperate measures, scraping scraps, boiling roots, even eating leather. The story of sturgeon at Jamestown is more than just a meal. It's a warning. Depending on one source of food could mean life one season and death the next. And just when the colonists thought the river had betrayed them, the tide turned again, bringing a new flavor that would define Virginia forever. 4th, oyster stew with herbs. When the sturgeon vanished, the colonists turned to the shoreline, and there, waiting in shallow beds, were oysters. Endless, briny, and shockingly easy to gather. Imagine wading into the James River, prying shells from the rocks, and tossing them into a kettle. Add a handful of wild herbs, maybe some onion or leek if you had it, and suddenly the colony had a stew that was warm, filling, and tasted like a gift from the sea. For many settlers, oyster stew was the first food in Virginia that felt like comfort. It was hearty, yet simple, salty, but soothing, a reminder that not every meal had to be born of desperation. The powhatan had eaten oysters for generations, and now the English learned to make them their own. But here's the hidden truth. Oysters weren't just food. They became currency. Settlers traded them, stored them, and even used the shells for lime in building projects. These little shellfish kept Jamestown alive long after the big sturgeon were gone. Still, as rich as the rivers were, some of the strangest survival foods didn't come from the land or the water. They slithered, and they smoked. 5. Smoked eel strips. Now here's where Jamestown takes a turn that might make you squirm. When fish and oysters weren't enough, settlers turned to something the English back home almost never touched: eel. In the rivers and muddy banks, these slippery creatures were everywhere, twisting like ropes under the water. To a starving colonist, that meant opportunity. They learned quickly: catch the eels, split them lengthwise, and lay them over smoke until the flesh turned firm and salty. Smoked eel strips weren't glamorous, but they lasted. They could be carried on long hunts, chewed slowly through the day, and gave men the strength to keep building, keep digging, keep fighting against hunger. And here's the twist. While it sounds strange to us now, smoked eel became a kind of delicacy in Jamestown. In fact, settlers wrote that it was one of the few foods they actually enjoyed. It was rich, fatty, and surprisingly satisfying, a rare bright spot in a menu filled with desperation. But just when you think things were turning around, Jamestown's meals got even stranger. Because the next dish? It wasn't about flavor. It was about scraping together whatever scraps of life the swamp could offer. 6. Rabbit broth with wild greens. When the woods grew quiet and game was scarce, Jamestown settlers turned to whatever small animals they could trap. Rabbits became a lifeline, not roasted in grand feasts, but boiled down into thin broths that stretched as far as possible. Picture a blackened iron pot simmering over a smoky fire, bones rattling inside, the broth tinted just enough to trick the stomach into thinking it was hearty. Into that pot went whatever could be found: wild greens plucked from marsh edges, bitter leaves, maybe a handful of onion or leeks if someone was lucky. It wasn't much, more of a warm drink than a meal. But for men who had gone days without solid food, that hot broth was life itself. And here's the hidden truth. It wasn't just about eating. That rabbit broth taught the settlers something bigger, that survival meant stretching every scrap. A single rabbit didn't feed a man, but boiled with greens, it fed a camp. Still, even with these small victories, Jamestown was always one season away from collapse. And the next dish proves it, because survival sometimes meant turning to foods the settlers never dreamed of eating back in England. 7. Cranberry mash. Among the swamps and thickets around Jamestown grew something the English had never seen before: small, bitter red berries clinging to low vines. The powhatan knew them well: cranberries. For the settlers, they were first a curiosity, then a revelation. When hunger hit and meat was scarce, these berries were mashed into a rough paste. Sometimes they were boiled with water, sometimes sweetened with a little honey if anyone had some left. The result was a sharp, sour mash that puckered the lips, but filled the belly. It wasn't comfort food, but it was survival food. And in a world where salt meat ruled, that tangy bite cut through the monotony like nothing else. Here's the twist. Cranberries weren't just a snack. They carried medicine. Colonists quickly learned that the berries helped fight off scurvy, the disease that ate away at gums and left men weak. A mouthful of tart mash could mean the difference between life and death through a long winter. So, while it wasn't roast beef or bread pudding, cranberry mash became one of the quiet heroes of Jamestown's table. But survival wasn't only about plants and berries. Sometimes it meant cracking open the forest itself for food that few back home would have dared to eat. 8. Roasted chestnuts. Every now and then, Jamestown settlers stumbled on a meal that felt almost festive. In the dense Virginia forests, chestnut trees grew tall and wide, dropping spiny shells full of treasure in the fall. For men used to scraping by on broth and salted fish, roasted chestnuts were a gift from nature. Picture it: a few settlers huddled around the fire, tossing the nuts into the coals until the shells split with a pop. The sweet, smoky aroma filled the camp, and for just a moment the air didn't smell like swamp and hunger. It smelled like home. Biting into the soft, nutty flesh, they tasted something rich, warm, and comforting. But here's the catch. Chestnuts didn't last long. Once the trees were picked clean, that sweetness disappeared, and the colony was back to scraping bark, roots, and scraps. Still, roasted chestnuts were remembered, a brief taste of plenty in a place where plenty almost never came. And while nuts could be roasted and eaten plain, the settlers also learned another trick from the forest: how to turn bitter acorns into stew that could actually keep them alive. 9. Acorn Nut Stew. In England, nobody would have thought twice about acorns. They were for pigs, not people. But in Jamestown, when hunger bit hard, settlers learned from the powhatan that those bitter nuts could be turned into food. The secret? Patience. First, the acorns had to be cracked and shelled, then soaked in water to wash out the harsh tannins. Sometimes they boiled them again and again, trading time for survival. Once the bitterness was gone, the settlers mashed the softened nuts into a paste, thickened it with water, and boiled it into a stew. The taste? Earthy, plain, and sometimes still a little bitter, but filling. And filling mattered more than flavor when stomachs growled night after night. What once seemed inedible now became a kind of bread substitute, a stew that stretched across days when meat and corn ran out. Here's the twist. Acorns weren't just food in Jamestown. They were proof of a mindset shift, that survival meant letting go of old ideas about what was fit to eat. If pigs thrived on it, so could people. And when the stew kept them alive through another freezing night, pride gave way to gratitude. But the forest didn't just give nuts. It gave feathers, wings, and a bird that would soon become America's most famous roast. 10. Wild Turkey Fire Roast. Long before it became the centerpiece of Thanksgiving, the wild turkey was already saving lives at Jamestown. The forests around the colony were full of them, big, wary birds with sharp eyes and fast legs. To catch one wasn't easy, but when a settler managed to bring a turkey down, the payoff was huge. Picture a fire crackling in the twilight, a plucked bird skewered on a spit, slowly turning as fat dripped into the flames. The smell would have drawn men from across the camp, hungry and hollow-eyed, waiting for their share. This wasn't just meat, it was a feast. One turkey could feed several men, filling them in a way broth or mash never could. But here's the twist. To the settlers, turkey was exotic. In England, they were used to chicken, goose, or partridge. Turkey was a New World bird, strange at first, then quickly embraced. It became a rare moment when desperation and delight met in the same meal. Still, turkey wasn't always there. The birds scattered when overhunted, leaving settlers once again grasping for other foods. And when the fields were bare and the woods went quiet, they turned to another gift of the land, one baked right in the ashes of the fire. 11th. Baked pumpkin in ashes. When the wheat and barley from England failed, settlers had to look to the strange, knobby fruits growing in powhatan fields. Pumpkins. At first, the colonists thought them odd, too tough, too coarse compared to English squashes. But hunger has a way of changing opinions. The simplest method was the most common, burying a whole pumpkin right in the hot ashes of a fire. Hours later, the shells split open, steaming, and inside was soft, sweet flesh that could be scooped out with a spoon. No sugar, no butter, just smoky, earthy pumpkin, a meal that filled the belly and warmed the bones. Here's the hidden truth. Baked pumpkin became more than survival food. It was the bridge between Old World and New, proof that crops native to America could carry English settlers through winters when their own supplies failed. Over time, pumpkin wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. But not every meal from the swamp forests carried that sweetness. Some were harder to swallow, quite literally, and one of the strangest survival dishes came crawling right out of the rivers. 12. Freshwater turtle roast. Down in the rivers and marshy banks, settlers discovered a slow-moving prize, freshwater turtles. Back in England, few men would have dreamed of eating them. But in Jamestown, turtle meat became survival gold. The process was simple and brutal. The shell was cracked open, the meat pulled out, and laid over hot coals until it sizzled. The result? A roast that was tender, oily, and filling enough to feed several men. For those who'd gone days on thin broth, turtle felt like a banquet. But here's the twist. Turtle wasn't just meat. The colonists found ways to use nearly every part. The fat made stews richer, the broth simmered from bones kept hunger away, and even the shells were sometimes repurposed as makeshift bowls. Nothing went to waste, because nothing could go to waste. Still, while turtles offered a meaty break from roots and grains, the skies above held another answer. And when a settler's musket brought down a bird from the marsh, the campfires once again smelled of roasting flesh. 13. Wild duck on the spit. In the marshes around Jamestown, wild ducks flocked by the hundreds. To men who had survived on stews of roots and scraps, these birds were a godsend. One good shot, or a well-placed snare, meant meat on the fire that night. Picture the scene. A duck, plucked and skewered, slowly turning over glowing coals. The fat dripped, hissing on the flames, sending up clouds of rich, savory smoke. For settlers who longed for the roasts of England, duck on the spit was as close as they'd get to home cooking. The meat was dark, tender, and filling, the kind of meal that made men forget, just for an evening, that they were starving in a swamp. But here's the twist. Wild duck didn't just feed the settlers. It also became a point of trade. The powhatan sometimes exchanged birds for tools, beads, or cloth, giving Jamestown a fragile lifeline. Each spit of roasting duck wasn't just food. It was survival diplomacy. Still, no matter how rich the meal, duck was a gamble. When the marshes grew quiet, bellies went empty again. And the next dish on Jamestown's table shows just how far they had to stretch their rations. 14. Boiled peas in broth. When supply ships managed to reach Jamestown, they often carried dried peas, a humble English staple. At home, peas might be simmered with ham or flavored with herbs. But in Virginia, most of the time, they were just boiled into thin broth. Imagine a pot of cloudy water with a few shriveled peas swirling inside. The taste was plain, almost bitter, but it was warm, and it filled a hollow stomach for a little while. For men dreaming of roasts and puddings, this was a cruel downgrade, a reminder that luxury was an ocean away. And here's the sting. The barrels of peas shipped across the Atlantic often rotted before they even arrived. Worms, mold, and dampness meant half the supply was thrown out or eaten anyway, sickening those who swallowed it. Still, the settlers couldn't afford pride. Boiled peas, no matter how pitiful, were better than nothing. But peas were just one part of England's rations. Another came in the form of grain, barley shipped over for bread and beer. Only in Jamestown it became something very different. 15th. Barley porridge. Barley was supposed to be the settlers' safety net. In England it was the backbone of bread, beer, and hearty porridge. But in Jamestown, barley became a symbol of disappointment. Most of the grain that survived the long sea voyage was spoiled, damp, moldy, crawling with weevils. Still, hunger didn't allow for waste. Colonists would boil it down into a thick, gray mush. Imagine lifting a wooden spoon heavy with porridge that smelled faintly sour, tasting of earth and salt. It was food in name only, but it kept the weak on their feet. Here's the bitter truth. Barley was supposed to give strength. Instead, it sometimes brought sickness. Settlers wrote of fevers and stomach pains after eating it, yet they went back to the pot again and again. Because when choices shrink, even bad food is survival food. And while the settlers forced down their porridge, the rivers offered another solution. Salted, preserved fish that had crossed the ocean with them, waiting to be fried into makeshift cakes. 16. Salted herring cakes. From the holds of the ships came barrels of salted herring, stiff, pungent fish packed in brine. Back in England, these were poor man's food, but in Jamestown, they were a treasure and a curse all at once. The settlers tried to make them palatable by pounding the salted flesh, mixing it with flour or mashed peas, then frying it into rough cakes over a fire. The smell was sharp, the taste overwhelmingly salty, but the cakes filled stomachs and gave energy to men too weak to swing an axe otherwise. Here's the cruel twist. Those same salted rations often spoiled in the humid Virginia air. The brine turned foul, the fish went rotten, and yet settlers still ate them. Many fell ill, but when hunger pressed in, sickness seemed a risk worth taking. Salted herring cakes were a bitter reminder that survival in Jamestown wasn't about taste or even health. It was about putting something in your belly to see another dawn. And when the barrels ran low, the settlers turned to the earth itself, digging for a strange root that became one of their most unlikely meals. 17. Groundnut root mash. When the barrels were empty and the forests seemed bare, the settlers dug into the soil, literally. What they found was a wild root the powhatan had long relied on, the groundnut. These tubers, buried deep in the earth, looked like small potatoes strung together on a vine. Pulled from the mud, the roots were washed, boiled, and mashed into a thick, earthy paste. The flavor was nutty and starchy, not unpleasant, but heavy in the stomach. Exactly what a starving man needed. For Jamestown, groundnut root mash was more than just food. It was survival pulled straight from the dirt. Here's the twist. To the settlers, these roots were strange, even suspicious at first. But once they realized how filling they were, the groundnut became a quiet hero of the colony. Some historians even argue that without it, Jamestown might not have survived those brutal early years. Still, the settlers couldn't live on roots alone. To keep spirits up, they sometimes mixed what little cornmeal they had with berries, boiling it into a pottage that was both tart and sweet, a rare comfort in a life of hunger. 18. Berry and cornmeal pottage. Every once in a while, Jamestown stumbled into a dish that almost felt like a treat. When berries were in season, wild grapes, blackberries, or cranberries, the settlers mixed them with coarse cornmeal and boiled the whole mess into a thick pottage. The result was simple but surprising, a tart sweet mash with just enough texture to break the monotony of roots and salted fish. Imagine a smoky wooden bowl of warm porridge, streaked purple from crushed berries, eaten by men who hadn't seen sugar in months. It wasn't pudding or pie, but for starving colonists, it was the closest thing to dessert. Here's the hidden truth. This dish also carried lessons from the powhatan, who had long combined maize with berries to stretch their food and add flavor. For the English, it was another moment of humility, realizing the only way forward was to adapt to the land and its people. But sweetness never lasted long in Jamestown. When the seasons turned and berries disappeared, the settlers went back to the salted stores, this time leaning on cod, boiled with the few root vegetables they had left. 19. Salt cod with turnips. From across the Atlantic came another old-world staple, salt cod. Packed in barrels and hardened like wood, it had to be soaked for hours just to make it chewable. In Jamestown, where fresh meat was rare and root vegetables scarce, cod became the fallback meal. Settlers would boil the tough, rehydrated fish with chopped turnips, creating a stew that was more functional than flavorful. The cod was salty, the turnips bitter, but together they filled the pot and stretched just a little further. Imagine gnawing on a spoonful of chewy fish and soggy root. Hardly a feast, but when your ribs showed through your shirt, it was enough. Here's the twist. Cod was supposed to be reliable, but by the time it crossed the ocean, some barrels arrived spoiled, crawling with worms, or so foul even the hungriest men gagged. And yet, more often than not, they ate it anyway. Hunger leaves no room for pride. Still, not every meal was misery. Every so often the skies gave up a bird big enough to remind settlers what a true roast felt like. 20. Roast goose over coals. When the marshlands came alive with honking flocks, settlers knew luck was on their side. A single goose, fat from the river grasses, could feed several men. And in Jamestown, that meant a night of relief. Picture the scene. A goose trussed and set over glowing coals, the skin blistering, fat dripping into the fire with a hiss. The smell alone would pull men from their huts, their mouths watering, their hunger sharpened. Compared to mushy porridge or salted cod, roast goose felt almost royal. But here's the twist. While a goose was a feast, it was also fleeting. Once carved and devoured, the hunger returned the next day, sharper than before. There was no guarantee of another bird, no promise the marshes would yield again. Every goose was a gamble, a temporary escape from the grind of starvation. Still, for one night, settlers could close their eyes and pretend they were back in England, eating a holiday bird with family, not fighting for survival in a swamp. And when the geese were gone, the colonists turned again to the earth, this time boiling humble garden crops into a thin, savory stew. 21. Onion and leek stew. Not every meal at Jamestown came from hunting or fishing. Sometimes survival meant going back to the simplest of crops, onions and leeks. These hardy plants grew in garden plots near the fort, and when game was scarce, they became the base for a thin, savory stew. Picture a blackened iron pot bubbling gently, the sharp bite of onion softening into sweetness, the leeks adding a grassy note. If the settlers had a bone, a scrap of fat, or even a pinch of herbs, they tossed it in, hoping to coax out just a little more flavor. The result was a broth that warmed the body, soothed the gut, and reminded men of home kitchens an ocean away. But here's the twist. While onion and leek stew was comforting, it was also fragile. A poor harvest, spoiled seed, or raided gardens meant the pot stayed empty. And without it, settlers fell back on harsher substitutes, or turned again to imported rations that carried their own risks. And one of those rations came not as food, but as drink, a bitter, weak ale brewed on ships that settlers gulped down daily, whether they liked it or not. 22. Small beer, ship-brewed ale. In Jamestown, even water could kill you. The brackish rivers around the fort carried disease, and men who drank straight from them often fell sick. That's why one of the most important foods wasn't food at all. It was small beer. Brewed weak on the ships before crossing the Atlantic, small beer was more like watered-down ale than anything you'd recognize today. It was low in alcohol, just enough to kill off bacteria, and sour on the tongue. Settlers drank it daily, sometimes more than water itself, because at least it was safer. But here's the catch. Barrels of beer didn't last forever. When supplies ran dry, men faced a cruel choice: risk disease from the river or endure thirst. And in those moments they longed for the sweetness of something, anything, to cut the bitterness of survival. That sweetness came not from sugar, but from the wild vines and orchards around them. Fruits that could be boiled down into syrupy treasures, rare bursts of flavor in a world of bland stews and salted meat. 23. Wild grape syrup. Among the tangled vines of Virginia, settlers found wild grapes hanging heavy in the summer sun. Unlike the cultivated varieties of Europe, these grapes were smaller, tart, and bursting with juice. To hungry men starved for sweetness, they were a revelation. The settlers crushed the grapes and boiled them down into a thick, dark syrup. Sometimes it was drizzled over porridge, other times mixed with water to make a weak, sweet drink. For men who hadn't tasted sugar in months, that grape syrup was as close to candy as Jamestown ever got. But here's the twist. Grapes spoiled fast, and the syrup didn't last long either. What seemed abundant in summer disappeared quickly, leaving only the memory of sweetness behind. Still, for those brief weeks, wild grape syrup gave the settlers a taste of joy, proof that the land could offer not just survival, but comfort. And when autumn came, another fruit appeared, one that could be dried and saved, turning into chewy, sun-baked cakes that sustained the colony through the leanest winters. 24. Sun-dried persimmon cakes. As summer faded, Jamestown's survival hinged on foods that could last. That's where the persimmon came in, a strange orange fruit that grew soft and sweet after the first frost. Eaten raw, it was sticky and rich. But the real trick was drying it. Settlers mashed the ripe pulp, spread it thin, and left it to bake in the sun. The result? Chewy, leathery cakes that looked plain but packed real staying power. These persimmon cakes could be stored for weeks, carried on hunts, or chewed slowly during long nights when the larders were empty. Here's the twist. What began as desperation turned into something close to tradition. Colonists wrote of persimmon bread, persimmon beer, even puddings flavored with the fruit once life in Virginia stabilized. What started as survival food eventually became a taste of the New World itself. But before we end the Jamestown table, there's one more dish to mention. A mix of foraged nuts and rare sweetness that gave the starving settlers a final reminder. Even in the hardest times, nature still had gifts to give. 25. Boiled walnuts with honey. In a world of bitter stews and salted fish, the rarest luxury came straight from the trees. Walnuts grew wild around Jamestown, their shells cracked open with stones or axes. Settlers would boil the nut meats to soften them, then, if fortune smiled, drizzle them with a little honey traded from the powhatan or gathered from wild hives. The result was something almost magical, sweet, nutty, and rich. For men who lived on porridge and roots, this was more than food, it was morale. A bite of boiled walnuts with honey could lift spirits, remind them of home, and give hope that survival wasn't just misery. But here's the truth. Treats like this were rare. Honey was precious, walnuts seasonal, and most days the settlers returned to their grim diet of broth, fish, and roots. Still, the memory of that sweetness carried them, proving that even in the harshest times, the land could surprise them with generosity. Jamestown's table was never about feasting. It was about grit, adaptation, and the thin line between hunger and survival. And the story of these 25 foods shows just how fragile and how determined America's first colony really was. When you picture Jamestown, it's easy to imagine the wooden palisades, the swampy waters, or the desperate letters sent back to England. But the real story of survival wasn't written in ink. It was written on the plate. Roasted maize that built a bridge between settlers and the powhatan, venison and goose that gave nights of fleeting abundance, turtle roasts, eel strips, even acorn stews that proved people will eat anything to stay alive. These 25 foods tell us something bigger. Jamestown wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance. Every bite was a gamble between hope and hunger, sickness and strength. And yet, out of that struggle came the roots of what would one day grow into American food itself. Corn, pumpkin, turkey, persimmon, even the humble onion stew. It's a reminder that the meals we take for granted today once meant survival. That sweetness, comfort, and plenty were carved out of bitterness, smoke, and fear.